Today, I have to begin with a warning that we're going to have a little math today in the homily. And some might say, oh, no one told me there was going to be math going to church. You know, as we're going back to school now, I think it's around second, third grade. The parents are helping the kids learn math. As I learned a couple years ago with the triplets, again, for some reason, they changed the way they do math. And so I was unable, basically, to help my kids do second grade math. Now Dami is going into second grade, so maybe in the 4 years they've changed math once again. And I remember my parents complaining about the same thing, and I didn't have any idea what they were talking about. But now I do, and now I feel old. But there's going to be a little bit of math today. But this is a new kind of math. Jesus is teaching us Christian math. And this is yet another way of thinking about how to calculate things. So the gospel reading today comes to us from Matthew chapter 18. And we have to understand the whole context in which the parable is told. In chapter 18, the whole chapter is dealing with community relations, specifically within the Christian community. So, and this was actually, we learned quite a bit with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls right after World War II. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learned that this community, which was about the same time as Jesus, had similar concerns. And they left us a scroll called the Manual of Discipline that was outlining a lot of the same things. And the basic question that Jews at this time in the first century in Palestine were dealing with, the basic question is, what do we do with someone within the religious community? What do we do when they sin? When they sin in general, or when they sin against someone else in the community. And actually, the Dead Sea Scrolls have a similar process as described earlier in chapter 18 of St. Matthew's Gospel. One, we go to the person personally and as soon as possible, and hoping to correct them. If they won't hear us, then we take one or two witnesses so that it may be established by two or three, and we try to convince a person. And the third and final step is we tell it to the church. This is the context now in which Peter's question comes up. So we hit verse 21. And in verse 21, as they're discussing this question of forgiveness within the community, it says, "Then Peter came to him, Jesus, and said, 'Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times?'" And Peter, we know by this point in the gospel, he's heard the Lord teach several times about the importance of forgiveness. And because this was such a live question in first century Judaism, it was normal and expected for disciples to have questions about this and to ask Jesus, what is your teaching about this? Because we know that other rabbis were saying that it was enough to forgive 3 times for the same sin. 3 times. This was the teaching of what later became, of what was the Pharisees, basically. And the Sadducees, another group within Judaism that controlled the temple, they considered the Pharisees to be liberals, to allow up to 3 times, a whole 3 times to forgive someone for the same sin. They said once. Now Peter comes along and he poses this question to Jesus. And then Peter offers, how many times should I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Peter thinks he's actually being wildly generous in offering 7 times to forgive your brother for the same sin. Up to 7 times? He thinks probably, look, he's buttering up the teacher. Look, I got the right answer. I've been paying attention. But in verse 22, the verse immediately before the parable today, Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. 70 times 7. This is Jesus' math. And I remember a couple of years ago in Florida at the parish, I started asking the kids to come up for youth sermons. And I remember I was sitting in the middle, and there were a lot of little kids, and they were sitting around, and it was actually, we were talking about this gospel, and I asked them, 70 times 7, how many times are we supposed to forgive? And this one kid shot his hand up, and I was expecting him to say, a lot, all the time, and he said, 490. And I was very impressed at his math skills, for he was very little, 490. And that is the answer that math teaches us, right? 490, that's the math answer. But Jesus is teaching us a different kind of math, a Christian math. And really what it means is an infinite amount. An infinite amount. There's no limit to this number. And actually, this phrase, 70 times 7, comes from Genesis chapter 4. And Jesus is very consciously using this from Genesis chapter 4. And even there, it also meant a number of fullness, an infinite amount. So it's this. Then Jesus goes on to illustrate what he means by this answer by telling the parable that we read in the gospel today. The Lord said this parable: the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the reckoning, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And so here we have a little bit more math. 10,000 talents. How much is that? Well, we know that there was a talent of silver. A talent was a measure, about 67 pounds of silver. 1 talent, 67 pounds of silver. So, and we know that 1 talent at that time was worth at least 6,000 denarii. 1 denarii was a day's wage. A day's wage. So a single talent was worth 6,000 days' wages. When you multiply this 10,000 talents, we're talking about over 333 tons of silver. We're talking about 200,000 years of average salary. 200,000 years of salary. This is how much 10,000 talents was. We actually think that it may possibly have been more than all the currency in circulation in the Persian kingdom. More currency than in circulation in all of Egypt. This was an enormous sum, an enormous sum. Now this man probably in the ears of those who were hearing this parable in Jesus' time he was a servant, perhaps the chief servant, and his job was to collect taxes for a certain region. And that's why somehow he had amassed this huge number. But it's a parable. It's not a real story. And so we're not even to think about it in terms of real numbers. We're to think about, it's almost like hearing about the numbers they throw around in Congress these days. It's a huge, fantastic amount. It's an amount beyond human reckoning. That's kind of what we're supposed to think of. This enormous sum of money. This is what the servant owes him. And it's interesting, too, when we're talking about debt, the word debt in Aramaic, which was the language Jesus would have been speaking, the word debt was the word also used for sins or offenses or trespasses. And when it's translated into Greek, they picked up the same word. So they used the word in Greek debts when they were talking about offenses. So in the Lord's Prayer, we say, forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. But it actually, literally, it says, forgive those who are in debt to us. Forgive those who are in debt to us. So there was this, in the mind of Jesus at this time, there was this connection between debt and sin. So just keep that in mind. So this servant is brought before him who owes him this enormous sum. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. And this was common at that time, a debtor's prison. They were thrown into prison. They were sold. They were thrown into prison. And in prison, they couldn't earn money. They couldn't keep a job. So what would happen was, in order to get them out of a prison where often torture would happen, it would force their family and loved ones who were outside to find some way to come up with the money to redeem them and get them out of prison. This was a harsh reality of life in the ancient world. So he has him sold as a slave, and his family, he has him put into prison, and his family sold. This was what he ordered, but what happened? So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. He will pay him everything. 200,000 years worth of salary, and he's promising that he's going to pay him everything. Out of pity for him, the Lord of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. So he goes beyond what the man even asked, and he forgave him this debt, this entire debt, 200,000 years worth of salary, billions and billions of dollars in today's money, and he forgives the whole thing because the man pleaded with him earnestly. But that same servant, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. 100 denarii would have been 100 days' wages, so you're talking 3.5 months' salary. It's not an insignificant amount of money, maybe something like $15,000, something like that. But in comparison to what he was just forgiven, it was 600,000 times less. 600,000 times less. And what does this man do? He finds this fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and besought him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. The same words that the man himself had used. And of course, as we know, the first servant had no mercy on him. Instead, had him thrown into prison. So what's the real sin here? The first servant, is it that he's apparently not very good at math? That he hasn't realized that he was forgiven so much more, and now this paltry amount is really not necessary? No, that's not the sin. What the sin is he's missing gratitude. Gratitude. He's forgotten the enormous debt that's just been forgiven to him, and it's left him unchanged. This is the sin. Instead of having his heart filled to the brim with gratitude, it's left his heart cold. He hasn't changed at all as a result of this encounter with the king. He hasn't remembered his own debt. Now, knowing as we do that the debt symbolizes, of course, sin. When we think of ourselves, how many times do we forget what we've been forgiven when we're dealing with someone else? This is another reason why confession is so valuable. To go to confession regularly reminds us of our own failings. And when I go to confession, I find that I am confessing the same sins again and again and again. Even worse. But it brings to my attention my own humility and my gratitude that God forgives me again and again and again. St. John Chrysostom says, what then are God's good deeds? He created us from nothing. He made the whole visible world for us, the heaven, the sea, the earth, animals, plants, and seeds. I must be brief because of the infinite number of his works. Into us alone of all that are on earth, he breathed a living soul. He planted a garden for us. He gave us a helpmate and set us over all the brute species, and he crowned us with glory and honor. And yet, after all this, when humanity turned out ungrateful toward its benefactor, he thought us worthy of an even greater gift, forgiveness. So the question for us that I would like for us to think about this week, brothers and sisters, is, should we even be asking questions like Peter asked at the beginning? How many times must I forgive my brother and sister? Even if we think that 7 or even 490 is a generous number, just by asking this question, aren't we thinking about it in the wrong way? We're asking, what is my obligation? So it's like saying, what's my obligation to God for all that he's given me, all that he's forgiven me, and all the good things of my life? What's my obligation? How many times must I go to church to praise my Creator? 3 times? 7 times in my lifetime? How many times am I obligated to praise my Creator? That's a bad question. It should be that we are transformed by this experience and this recognition of what God has done for us, how much he has forgiven us and how much he has given us. And not out of obligation do we go to church, but out of this wonderful Greek word philotimo, this earnest desire to repay even the smallest kindness with even more kindness in return. It should flow from our hearts that we want to come to church. We want to be merciful to our fellow servants, always keeping in mind how much we have been forgiven and how much we have been given. This is not a rational calculation. This is not the math of this world, but this is Christian math. This is what we have to keep before our eyes at all times. Amen.